Maria Rivera hadn't intended to paint the wall at first. The idea came slowly, like a breath held too long, then released in a burst. It began with the silence, the kind that sets in after a death, not just in the space a person leaves behind, but in the corners of your thoughts, your routine, your voice. After her mother passed in the spring of 2023, Maria found herself moving through her days like a wind-up figure, going through motions with practiced grace but no weight beneath her steps. Cooking had always been her comfort, a way to honor her roots, to bring joy, to speak without speaking. But even that felt hollow now. Something had to shift. She needed something permanent, something public. She had purchased the small townhouse on Alder Street 6 months earlier, using most of her savings and a modest loan. It wasn't large, but it had a side wall that faced a little-used alley, the kind of in-between space that most homeowners ignored. The wall was solid concrete, stained with age and not technically decorative, just a boundary between her home and the narrow strip of asphalt used mostly by garbage trucks and early-morning joggers. But Maria had seen something else in it. A canvas, a backdrop, maybe even a mirror. Something that could say the things she wasn't ready to put into words. Her mother had been a teacher for 30 years. A daughter of immigrants who rose quietly through life with the kind of steel that hides behind gentle smiles. Maria grew up with stories in 2 languages, music on a cracked radio, and tamales made from scratch even when her mother worked double shifts. Their family didn't have luxury, but they had dignity, pride, and something deeper, a sense of legacy. Maria knew she didn't want her grief to settle into nothingness. Her mother had given too much to fade. The mural, then, became a kind of act of resistance, not loud or confrontational, but steady, symbolic, and deeply intentional. She began sketching at night after her private cooking classes were done, piecing together symbols that felt like fragments of memory. Wind-tangled hair, scraps of paper that resembled old letters, hands kneading masa, a vague skyline in the distance. That could be Austin, or maybe a dream version of it. The final design wasn't something she shared with many people. It wasn't commercial, it wasn't cute, it was haunting, graceful, and complex, like grief itself. Over a single weekend, she brought it to life, section by section, using high-quality exterior paints and sealing agents she had researched meticulously. She wore headphones to drown out the passing cars and focused entirely on the movement of the brush, the feel of her hand against the concrete, the slow alchemy of sorrow turning into color. When she finished on Sunday evening just before the sun dipped too low, she didn't take a photo. She just stood back, breathing the humid Texas air, and let it settle into the wall as if it had always been there. She didn't expect a reaction, not really. But people noticed. Neighbors walking dogs slowed down. A cyclist stopped, took off his sunglasses, and just looked for a full minute before nodding silently and riding off. A pair of teenage girls took selfies in front of it, giggling. A middle-aged man she didn't know left a note taped to her mailbox that read simply, "Thank you for making this corner beautiful again." It wasn't viral, and she didn't want it to be. It was community-level attention. Quiet appreciation, word-of-mouth recognition. That was enough for Maria. For the first time in nearly a year, she felt something other than weight in her chest. She felt anchored. She had created something of meaning out of pain. The letter arrived 4 days later. It wasn't mailed. It was folded and stuffed between her storm door and the delivery box from the local produce co-op. The paper was thick, official-looking, with a centered header in all caps. Notice of unauthorized exterior alteration. Below, it detailed her alleged violation of the neighborhood visual code, referencing item 412 regarding unapproved aesthetic, modifications facing public pathways. The language was dry but sharp, the mural was deemed inappropriate, unapproved, and to be removed within 10 calendar days. Failure to comply, it warned, could result in fines of up to $3,000 and further legal action as deemed necessary. There was no signature, no phone number, no official seal from the city. Just a printed name. Karen Lawton, president of the Alder Community Residence Group. Maria read it twice, then a third time, as a hollow thump built in her chest. The wall was hers. The deed to the property included it. She had checked everything before painting. She wasn't part of any formal homeowners association. That had been one of the reasons she'd chosen this part of the city, where regulation was loose and people mostly minded their own business. But this letter, it reeked of something more than policy. It felt personal. She didn't know Karen, not really. They'd met briefly at a block gathering where Karen handed out laminated pamphlets about preserving the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony and community cohesion. Maria had said hello and walked away. Apparently, that had been enough to warrant attention. Still, she didn't react. Not right away. Instead, she did what her mother would have done. She gathered documents. She checked the city's online records and confirmed again that her wall fell entirely within her lot lines. She reviewed her purchase papers, her insurance filings, and even the email thread she had with the previous owner, who had once tried to install a trellis on that same wall and had been told by a city clerk that it was entirely under personal discretion. No public easement. No shared ownership. No issue. Maria then wrote a formal letter, calm, clear, and professional, to the Alder Community Residence Group. She included scans of her property map, a photo of the mural, and a statement outlining the personal significance of the work. She asked politely for clarification on the process that led to the notice and under what authority Karen was issuing removal demands. She received no reply. Instead, 2 nights later, someone painted a wide streak of gray primer across the mural's lower left quadrant. It wasn't a full cover-up, just a bold swipe, as if to make a point. The paint dripped like blood in the morning sun. Maria stared at it for a long time before going inside to get her camera. She took pictures from 3 angles. She filed a police report for property defacement. The officer was polite but non-committal. "It'll be difficult to follow up without a witness," he said. "Could be teenagers, could be anyone." Maria didn't argue. She simply asked for a copy of the case number and thanked him. That evening, she began repainting the damaged section, her brush moving slower now, her shoulders heavier. The act didn't feel defiant. It felt necessary, a quiet insistence that her grief, her heritage, her voice wouldn't be erased so easily. Karen, however, wasn't done. Within a week, a printed flyer began appearing on neighborhood doors. "Are you comfortable with visual chaos on your street?" Beneath the headline was a photo of Maria's mural, poorly lit and taken at an angle that distorted its form. The bottom of the page included a community feedback hotline, a Google Voice number, and a list of discussion points for the next residents' meeting. Maria found a copy wedged in her front gate. She didn't go to the meeting. Instead, she sent a registered letter to the city's Department of Urban Aesthetics and Cultural Preservation, a rarely used but legitimate office created to oversee murals and public art initiatives. She included her design, her story, and a request for evaluation. She didn't know if anything would come of it, but she had no other paths left. What she did know, with sudden clarity, was this. The fight wasn't about paint. It was about power. Who had it, who didn't, and who dared to challenge it with a brush instead of a permit. Maria wasn't trying to be a symbol. She just wanted to keep the memory of her mother alive on the wall that she owned. But in this neighborhood, even that was too much for some to tolerate. And something told her, this was only the beginning. The morning after the streak of gray primer appeared across the mural, Maria stood in the alley for nearly an hour, just staring at the damage. It hadn't been accidental. The placement was too deliberate. The choice of color too intentional. Whoever had done it had made no attempt to cover the entire image or even disguise their method. It was an interruption, a calculated act of disruption, like someone loudly clearing their throat in the middle of a eulogy. She had considered painting over it immediately, but something inside her told her to wait. She took more photos, from every possible angle, making sure the lighting and timestamps were clear. Then she walked the alley from end to end, checking for nearby surveillance cameras. There were two, one mounted on the back of a neighboring garage, the other half hidden beneath a roof awning above a laundry delivery chute. Neither was hers. Maria hesitated, then knocked on the garage owner's door. A middle-aged woman with a weathered face and gardening gloves answered, blinking at Maria in the morning light. After a few cautious explanations and assurances that she wasn't accusing anyone, Maria asked if the woman's camera might have captured the alley the night before. The woman said it might, but her son handled all the tech. She promised to check. Later that day, Maria received a call. The camera hadn't recorded anything. The SD card had been wiped. Inexplicably. The woman was apologetic, but Maria knew better than to believe in coincidences now. That evening, Maria checked her own footage again, from the front and side of her house, and noticed something unsettling. Around 2:38 a.m., the motion light near the alley side had flickered on and off 3 times in a span of 40 seconds. The camera hadn't captured anyone directly, but the light sensor indicated movement. Someone had been there, just out of frame. She wrote it down, added it to the folder she was now keeping, not because she planned to sue, not yet, but because she had learned that memories were unreliable and systems only listened when you spoke their language. Timestamps, affidavits, diagrams. A few days later, an envelope appeared in her mailbox. Unlike the first notice, this one was official. It came from the city Zoning and Compliance Office. Inside, the letter claimed that Maria's mural violated certain visual height restrictions outlined in subsection 6.3.1 of the Residential Exterior Presentation Code. The language was vague, technical, and riddled with references to documents she'd never seen. But what stood out was the fact that a formal complaint had been filed against her, triggering a review of her exterior modifications. The complainant was listed by name, Karen Lawton. Maria sat down at her kitchen table, the letter spread out before her. The language was bureaucratic, but the intent was surgical. She had known Karen disliked the mural. That much was obvious. But to file an official complaint, to turn this into a code violation, wasn't about personal taste anymore. It was about using the system as a weapon. Maria reread the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in her growing file. She knew what this meant. She would have to respond formally, provide documentation, and possibly appear before a local review board. None of this was surprising. What surprised her was how personal it suddenly felt. Karen hadn't stopped at social disapproval. She was now using the city's own regulatory structure to erase the mural through official channels. The legal equivalent of wiping a canvas clean with gloves on. That night, Maria attended the neighborhood's open forum. Not because she wanted to confront Karen, but because she needed to observe. She sat in the back of the community center room, watching as the usual crowd filtered in. Retirees with clipboards, dog owners in tennis shoes, a few bored spouses dragged in for quorum. Karen stood near the front, wearing her usual pastel cardigan and that practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. When the meeting began, the minutes were read, votes were taken, and mundane topics, sidewalk cracks, noise ordinances, were discussed with inflated importance. Then came the visual environment segment. Karen adjusted her papers and, with careful neutrality, raised the issue of unauthorized artwork negatively impacting community cohesion and resale aesthetics. She didn't name Maria. She didn't have to. Everyone knew. He simply raised his phone and took a single photo of her posture, her location, and the fact that she was clearly targeting the sculpture again. There would be no spontaneous support here, no spontaneous rallying of neighbors around principle. This wasn't a movie. This was how people operated when they feared disruption. They retreated. The next day, a notice appeared on the community bulletin board at the park entrance, one of those laminated announcements with clean graphics and friendly colors. It invited residents to a discussion about neighborhood aesthetics and visual harmony. At the bottom, in smaller text, was a list of recent concerns, including unsanctioned visual installations visible from public routes. Maria took a photo of it. She noticed the staples used to pin the notice were unusually thick. Industrial, not the kind sold at local stores. Small detail, but it stuck in her mind. Later that week, Maria received another letter. This one hand-delivered. It wasn't an official notice, but a signed petition from several neighbors requesting that she remove the mural. Some names were familiar, some weren't. The language was polite, even apologetic in tone, but the message was clear. Take it down. For the sake of peace. For the sake of uniformity. The pressure wasn't just from Karen anymore. It was metastasizing. People who had once nodded at her in the mornings now avoided eye contact. A few even crossed the street when they saw her coming. Still, Maria held firm. She filed her formal response to the city's zoning complaint, complete with property documents, her mural sketch archive, and a statement about her intent and cultural background. She contacted a zoning attorney for consultation. A measured step, not cheap, but necessary. The attorney, a sharp woman in her 50s named Ellis Tran, listened carefully, then told her plainly, "This is a textbook case of aesthetic suppression under vague code interpretation. It's legal bullying, but you did the right thing by filing first." Ellis explained that if the mural could be classified as cultural or artistic expression with community relevance, Maria might be able to file for protection under the Public Visual Culture Act, a relatively obscure but valid piece of legislation used in similar cases before. Encouraged, Maria submitted her mural to the city's Cultural Visual Registry. It wasn't a guarantee, but it triggered a temporary hold on enforcement. For now, no fines, no removal. But that didn't mean Karen was done. One morning, Maria woke to find 3 large trash bags dumped against the base of the mural. Torn open, reeking, filled with raw food waste and broken bottles. It wasn't ordinary litter. It was deliberate, disgusting, and strategically placed. She called the city's waste services to file a complaint. They sent someone to clean it up, but the man who arrived looked at her like she was the one causing trouble. "That's the mural people keep talking about, huh?" he muttered before getting back in his truck. Maria didn't respond. She just watched as he drove away. And that night, for the first time since moving in, she locked all her windows, double-checked her motion lights, and sat at the kitchen table until past 2 a.m., staring at nothing. She had thought she was prepared for a fight about art, about aesthetics, about ownership. But she hadn't expected this level of quiet cruelty, the kind that doesn't scream but whispers and poisons. And though she didn't know it yet, this was still only the surface. Maria hadn't spoken to her neighbors in over a week. Not out of protest, not in bitterness, but because she began to sense, unmistakably, that something had shifted in the tone of their glances and gestures. Where once there had been cautious smiles or polite nods, Now there was avoidance. Not outright hostility, at least not yet, but the kind of cold courtesy that people use when they don't want to take sides but are already leaning in one. She noticed it in the small things. The way a woman pushing a stroller turned her face toward the street just as Maria passed. The sudden, uncomfortable silence in line at the cafe when her name was called. The conversations that stopped too abruptly. When she walked by the local produce stand. These were not coincidences. These were signals, and they were adding up. By this point, Maria had received the zoning compliance response confirming that her case had been temporarily paused pending the city's review of her mural under cultural consideration. The response had been carefully worded, offering no comfort but extending no immediate threat either. It was a holding pattern, a bureaucratic breath being drawn while the city figured out how to categorize her painting, cultural asset or code violation. That ambiguity gave her a thin layer of protection, but it also gave Karen more time. And Karen, as Maria was learning, never let time go to waste. It began, again, with silence. No additional complaints, no new flyers, no formal objections. For a few days, things seemed to settle. Maria returned to her kitchen work, conducted her small private workshops, and even managed to repaint the lower corner of the mural that had been smeared weeks earlier. She didn't let herself believe the hostility had ended, but she allowed herself to breathe. Until one afternoon, as she walked past the side of her property, she noticed something strange. The white line had been spray-painted onto the pavement, running along the alley, stopping just before the base of the mural wall. At first, she assumed it was city maintenance, perhaps utility markings, but there were no identifiers, no accompanying signage, no work notices. It was just the line, perfectly straight, unnaturally clean, bisecting her alley access with quiet finality. Maria didn't touch it. She simply took a picture and made a note in her file. That same evening, 2 men in gray utility shirts showed up near the edge of the alley. They were unloading small cones from a work van with no company logo. Maria stepped outside and asked what they were doing. One of them, a man in his late 30s with a shaved head and dark sunglasses, glanced at her briefly before saying they were surveying. She asked who sent them. He didn't answer. She pressed again, calmly. He told her if she had a concern, she could call it in. Then they placed the cones along the white line, took a few measurements with a laser tool, marked some points with chalk, and left within 15 minutes. Maria did call it in. She contacted the city's infrastructure and maintenance department, gave them the time, description, and details. They confirmed that no work had been scheduled in that alley and that no city personnel had been dispatched to her address. When she asked if private contractors could operate in public access zones without notification, the clerk hesitated, then told her, "Not without proper authorization. That sounds off." She filed a report and again added everything to her file. The following morning, Maria noticed the cones were gone, but now a laminated sign had been zip-tied to the chain-link fence beside the alley. It read, "Future Municipal Access Zone, Pending Review." It had no city seal, just a generic font and a made-up-looking acronym, NCBR, Neighborhood Cleanliness and Beautification Urban Renewal. A web search brought up nothing. It was a fiction. But someone had gone to the trouble of printing, laminating, and affixing this sign in full view of anyone walking past her wall. Maria removed it carefully and kept it. That evening she visited her attorney, Ellis Tran, again and laid out the entire sequence. Ellis listened silently, her fingers steepled, her eyes sharp. When Maria finished, Ellis nodded once and said, "They're testing thresholds, what they can get away with before you react. It's strategic erosion. If you hadn't filed that zoning appeal, they'd be moving faster." Maria asked what her legal options were. Ellis outlined a few. civil injunction, possible cease and desist based on false representation, and a request for a city inspection to verify any unauthorized land demarcation. Maria agreed to all of it. She was tired of documenting. She needed to act. 3 days later, an inspector from the city arrived, clipboard in hand, polite but skeptical. He walked the perimeter of her property, measured the alley setback, and took notes. He confirmed what Maria already knew. The wall was hers. The alley was not a designated access route. The white line had no official basis. He photographed the remnants of the chalk marks and the zip tie locations. He told her he would file a statement, but added, "These kinds of things don't usually escalate unless someone pushes hard." That same evening, as Maria stood on her porch sipping tea, she noticed someone standing at the far end of the alley near the fire hydrant. A woman, maybe in her 60s, dressed in beige slacks and a floral blouse, holding a clipboard and staring at the mural. Maria couldn't see her face clearly, but she could tell the woman wasn't just passing by. She was studying it, head tilted, lips pursed. After a minute, the woman wrote something down, turned and walked off in the opposite direction. Maria followed at a distance, staying behind parked cars, keeping her steps light. The woman walked straight to Karen's house and knocked once. Karen opened the door immediately. No surprise, no pleasantries, just a brief exchange of papers and a nod. Maria turned back before they saw her, heart pounding harder than she expected. The next morning, another letter. This time, not from the city or the residents group, but from an insurance agency, her own homeowner's policy provider. The letter stated that a series of neighborhood complaints and possible exterior code infractions had triggered a reassessment of risk. Effective immediately, her premium would increase by 18%. No specific violations were cited, only the vague reference to instability of surrounding compliance behavior. She called the agency, demanded clarity. After 3 transfers, someone finally admitted that concerned residents had submitted documentation about visual pollution and exterior disruption, referencing her address. Maria asked if one of those residents had been named Karen Lawton. The line went silent. Then the woman on the phone said, "I'm not at liberty to confirm individual contributors." Maria laughed. It wasn't bitter or angry, just hollow. She thanked the woman and hung up. By now, her savings were dwindling. The mural had brought her pride, and it had brought her pain. The response had gone from irritating to coordinated. She knew it was Karen at the center, but what shook her was how many others had become complicit, through silence or passivity or quiet participation. This was how pressure worked in places like this. It didn't need to shout. It just needed to repeat slowly until resistance cracked under the weight of constant friction. That week, her private cooking session saw a sharp drop in bookings. 2 regular clients canceled with vague excuses. One wrote, "I just think there's too much drama around your place lately. Hope you understand." Maria did understand. She didn't blame them, but she also didn't forget. Then came the final straw. One evening, she returned home after picking up supplies to find that someone had drilled small holes into the base of her mural wall. Tiny punctures, evenly spaced, subtle enough not to draw immediate attention, but deep enough to create channels for water damage. Someone had tried to sabotage the structural integrity of the mural without visibly destroying it. It was sabotage by slow decay. Maria didn't cry. She didn't rage. She just stood there, as the dusk settled around her like ash, and made a decision. This wasn't going to end because she hoped it would. It wasn't going to resolve itself with polite letters or silent resilience. She was going to fight back, not with emotion, not with anger, but with precision, with patience, and with every legal and institutional tool she could find. Karen had started a quiet war. Maria was going to finish it, with the same brushstrokes that started it all, and with far sharper edges. Maria had always believed in the power of the persistence, not confrontation. Her mother had taught her that. One quiet step at a time, one problem solved before the next, always moving forward with purpose, never out of spite. But standing in her alley, staring at the small boreholes drilled near the base of the mural, she realized that whoever was doing this wasn't just trying to erase her work. They were trying to exhaust her, to chip away at her will until she gave up and left. That was the strategy. Wear her down, not with a single attack, but with a dozen small ones, each one just subtle enough to be denied, each one just painful enough to add to the burden. It was cowardice masked as process, aggression disguised as policy. She filed yet another police report. The responding officer, a new face this time, took her statement, walked around the property, made a few non-committal remarks, and left with the same look Maria had seen before. Detached concern. She doubted he'd write much down. She didn't blame him. To outsiders, this wasn't violence. There were no broken windows, no graffiti, no intrusions with screaming alarms. Just suggestion. Just slow degradation. And that made it more dangerous, more insidious. But Maria didn't retreat. Instead, she reached out, carefully, selectively. She contacted the Department of Cultural Preservation again, requesting an in-person consultation. They agreed, and 2 representatives visited her property the following week. One was a man in his late 40s named Colin, wearing horn-rimmed glasses and holding a clipboard filled with notes. The other, a younger woman named Janine, who carried a digital tablet and took photos in silence. They walked the length of the mural, inspecting the art, noting the structural damage, and asking pointed questions about the neighborhood history, the timeline of complaints, and the community reaction. Maria answered as plainly and precisely as she could. She showed them her documentation, letters, photographs, diagrams, even the laminated sign and the fake survey line. Colin asked only one personal question. Why this mural? Why here? Maria paused before answering. Because my mother never had a space like this. Because people like her, quiet people, working people, disappear without trace unless someone leaves a mark. Janine nodded and took another photo, this time of Maria herself, standing in front of the damaged lower corner of the mural. A week later, Maria received the letter. Her mural had been accepted for preliminary inclusion in the city's Cultural Mapping Initiative, a program designed to identify and protect community-created artwork of public value. The letter wasn't a guarantee of permanent protection, but it meant something crucial. Her mural was now on record. It was no longer just paint on a wall. It was an active subject of municipal cultural interest. That language alone, Ellis explained, was enough to delay any action taken against her under neighborhood codes or private complaint. It also meant her case would be reviewed by a special panel in the coming months, with the potential for designation as an official public artwork. When Maria read that sentence, she didn't smile. She exhaled. That was all. But the designation didn't come without consequence. The morning after the letter arrived, Maria noticed a strange new addition near her mural. A small white sticker, no bigger than a coin, pressed against the lower corner of the concrete. It bore a QR code and nothing else. Curious, she scanned it with her phone. It led to an anonymous website titled Visual Decline. The homepage featured a grainy photo of her mural with the caption, "This is what happens when boundaries are ignored." Below, it was a comment section filled with complaints, most of them anonymous, all of them venomous. Ooh, eyesore. Outsider trash. Turning the block into a slum. Some of the comments used coded language, the kind of veiled prejudice that feigns civility but stinks of contempt. Maria didn't react immediately. Instead, she took a screenshot of the page, printed out a copy, and added it to her growing folder of evidence. Then she sent the entire packet, copies of the photos, the damage, the sticker, and the QR code, to Ellis. Her attorney responded within hours. Good. Keep collecting. They're building a pattern, but so are we. This could become harassment if they push one step too far. Maria didn't mention the page to her neighbors. She didn't confront Karen. She knew better than to give fuel to those who thrived on outrage. But she changed her routines. She started walking her property perimeter each morning. She upgraded her motion sensor lights. She kept her phone charged and nearby at all times. Not because she felt afraid exactly, but because she no longer trusted the rules to protect her. That sense of insulation that homeownership once gave her, gone, replaced by watchfulness. Still, it wasn't all shadows. One morning, she found a note taped to her front gate. It was written in pencil on a piece of sketchpad paper. Your mural reminds me of my grandmother. Thank you for keeping her alive, even if you didn't know her. There was no name. Just that. Maria folded the note and placed it inside her recipe book, between pages stained with cinnamon and red chili oil. Small kindnesses were rare now, but they mattered. And then, unexpectedly, the city called. Not the cultural department this time, but the Office of Public Routes and Tourism. A soft-spoken administrator named Alan Flores explained that a new walking tour was being piloted, focused on authentic, community-driven street art. We saw the report about your mural, he said. The committee thinks it could be a valuable stop on the South Ridge extension. Maria was stunned. She hadn't applied. Alan clarified. Someone on the committee had submitted a recommendation. They wouldn't reveal who. Within a week, the listing appeared online. Her mural, untitled, still bruised, still beautiful, was now point 7 on the South Ridge Cultural Passage Tour, with an optional audio commentary that read, in part, created by a local resident as a tribute to legacy and loss. This mural stands as a symbol of personal expression within contested public space. Maria stared at the listing for a long time. She didn't feel triumph. Not yet, but she felt seen. That same night, someone poured bleach across her herb garden. The basil turned black within hours. The lavender wilted. The soil reeked. Maria didn't even bother calling the police. She just took photos, sealed the garden, and logged the incident in her file. This was her midpoint. Not a victory. Not a loss. Just the deep inhale before the next wave hit. Maria had thought the bleach in her herb garden would be the worst of it. A symbolic act of spite meant to signal Karen's frustration at having lost control of the narrative. But the escalation that followed wasn't symbolic, and it wasn't subtle. It began on a Wednesday morning, just before 7, with the deep mechanical growl of diesel engines. Maria was in her kitchen grinding coffee when she heard the sound, distant but growing louder, layered with metallic clanking and short bursts of shouting. She walked to the back door, opened it, and was hit with a sudden wave of engine exhaust. When she turned the corner into the alley, she saw a crew of construction workers setting up portable barriers and unloading sacks of concrete mix from a flatbed truck. 2 men were already hauling rebar toward the edge of her property. Another was digging shallow trenches directly in front of her mural wall. At first, she thought it might be unrelated. A city project, maybe. Something about sewer lines or drainage. But then she saw Karen, clipboard in hand, standing a few feet away from the crew foreman, pointing at the wall and nodding. She wore that same powder blue cardigan she always wore to public meetings. Her expression serene, as though she were supervising a flower arrangement and not an unsolicited construction site against someone else's home. Maria approached the foreman directly, trying to keep her voice level, and asked what they were doing. The man looked down at his clipboard, flipped a page, and muttered something about an alley restoration project, approved by Property Coordination. Maria asked who approved it. He gave her a name she didn't recognize, then added, "Talk to the client. We just billed." She turned to Karen, who smiled without warmth, and said, "It's part of the Neighborhood Beautification Initiative. You must have seen the flyer." Maria had seen no such flyer, and even if she had, she knew there was no legal basis for construction activity on her property without a formal easement or city order. She told Karen flatly that this was trespassing. Karen didn't flinch. "According to our interpretation of the boundary," she said, "the edge of the alley includes a 3-foot municipal access buffer. We're reinforcing the walkway with public safety in mind." Maria responded that her property documents showed no such buffer, that she'd confirmed the boundary lines with both the city and her own attorney. Karen raised an eyebrow, then turned away without replying, speaking again to the foreman. Maria stormed inside and called Ellis, her voice tight with controlled rage. Within 10 minutes, Ellis had dispatched a cease-and-desist order to the construction company and scheduled an emergency injunction filing with the city. Meanwhile, Maria returned to the alley, stood between the workers on the wall, and refused to move. She didn't shout, she didn't threaten. She simply stood there, unmoving, as the sun rose higher and the heat began to creep up from the pavement. Eventually, the foreman made a call, spoke in low tones, then waved for his crew to stop. The work paused. The trucks idled for a while, then pulled back. By late afternoon, the alley was quiet again, but the trenches remained. The dirt was torn, the edge of her wall exposed, and her mural now carried fine splatters of dried concrete dust. That night, Maria couldn't sleep. She sat at her desk cataloging the entire incident, time-stamped photos, voice memos of what the foreman had said, satellite overlays of her property lines, a scanned copy of her deed, and a copy of the cultural designation letter. She printed everything, not just for Ellis, but for herself. She was done reacting. She was going to preempt every next move. The following week was silent, eerily so. No more construction, no more letters, no new flyers or anonymous threats. But then her mail started arriving late, or not at all. Packages were left at the wrong door. 2 scheduled grocery deliveries were marked as refused, despite no one coming to the door. When she called the service, they told her someone had answered and declined the orders. Maria installed a new doorbell camera. The footage showed no deliveries at all. Someone was interfering before they reached her house. She reported it to the postal supervisor, who promised to investigate. Nothing changed. Instead, a new letter arrived. Not from Karen, not from any neighborhood group, but from the city's sanitation division. It claimed that a recent inspection had flagged her trash enclosure as non-compliant, citing improper lid fastening and obstruction of the public path. Maria's trash bins had been in the same place for 6 months. No one had ever complained before. When she checked her camera footage, she saw a man in a fluorescent vest she didn't recognize walking around the side of her property, snapping photos of the bins, then leaving without saying a word. She forwarded the footage to Ellis, who began drafting a pattern of harassment complaint. Around the same time, 2 of her former cooking students, neighbors from a few blocks down, emailed her apologetically to cancel their standing appointments. One of them admitted off the record that she had received a letter, unsigned, suggesting that Maria's house was under active code review and pending further investigation. The letter warned that any business conducted on the premises might be affected. It was written to look official. It wasn't, but it had been enough to scare them. Maria didn't blame them. Fear was contagious. So was inconvenience. It was easier to avoid trouble than to stand beside it. She knew that now. Then the mural itself was hit again. This time, it wasn't paint or acid or trash. It was silence. One morning, Maria woke to find the alley cordoned off with yellow tape that read, "Restricted Access, Maintenance." There were no workers, no tools, no vehicles. Just the tape. She ducked beneath it and found a laminated notice taped to the fence that read, "Alley closed for rodent mitigation. Do not enter." It bore a city logo, but something about the font looked off. She scanned the QR code at the bottom. It led nowhere. When she called the city, they told her no such closure had been issued. They sent an inspector that afternoon. He confirmed it was a forgery. "Looks real," he said, shaking his head. "But this isn't one of ours." Maria kept the sign. She didn't even bother reporting it anymore. She knew it wouldn't be the last. 2 days later, she received a formal citation from the city's Business Oversight Unit. It accused her of operating an unlicensed public performance space. When she called to dispute it, she was informed that the citation had been triggered by a tip, linking her mural to organized tours without a public entertainment license. Maria explained that she had not initiated the tour, that the city itself had added her to the walking route. The clerk, weary, told her to submit a correction form and wait 6 to 8 weeks for resolution. She hung up and sat still for nearly an hour. Then she called Alan Flores, the man who had informed her about the tour listing in the first place. He was surprised, apologetic. He promised to intervene, to send a clarification. Within 3 days, the citation was voided. But the message was clear. Karen and her allies were now playing on a broader field, leveraging every corner of municipal red tape to make Maria's life difficult. They weren't trying to remove the mural anymore. They were trying to remove her. And then the anonymous note arrived. It wasn't mailed. It was slipped under her front door, a single sheet of paper folded twice, no envelope. Typed. No header, no signature. It read, "If you insist on remaining, consider that some structures have weak foundations. One day the wall may come down, accidentally. For safety's sake, don't be too attached to concrete." Maria read it twice. Then she locked her door, turned off the porch light, and sat on the floor with her back to the wall. She called Ellis. Ellis told her to report it, to keep the letter, to scan it, and send it immediately. Maria did all of that, but she didn't feel safer. She felt watched. She felt hunted. Not in the dramatic, cinematic way, but in the slow, grinding sense of attrition, of pressure building without relief. That night, she didn't sleep in her bedroom. She slept on the couch, light on, phone in hand. By now, even the mural seemed changed. She walked past it one morning and noticed how the colors had dulled slightly. The surface gritty with dust from the nearby construction. The edges dimmer from the partial shade of new fencing someone had installed next door. But still, it stood. Still, it faced the alley with quiet dignity. The figure at its center staring into the wind, head unbowed, arms open. Maria stood in front of it and whispered, "You're not leaving." "Neither am I." And then she turned back to her house, started the kettle, and prepared her next report. Because this was war now, and she had no intention of losing. It was a Tuesday morning when the scaffolding appeared. No warning, no permits, no trucks, just scaffolding, already assembled, rising up along the far end of the alley like ribs around the mural's heart. Maria saw it as soon as she opened her back door, and for a long minute, she just stared. It wasn't construction scaffolding. It was too clean, too temporary, designed not for building but for reaching. The metal joints were new, unpainted, and glinted in the light. 2 planks ran across the midsection of the wall, placing anyone who climbed them at perfect height to reach the center figure of her mural. There was no note, no tag, no sign, just the structure standing like a threat without words. Maria walked toward it, touched the metal. It was cold and firm. She circled once, then went inside and called Ellis. The voice on the other end of the line was already tight with understanding. "We're done waiting," Ellis said. "Let's go public." Maria had avoided media. She'd resisted online attention, resisted the urge to post, to shout, to name names. She wasn't interested in being a symbol or a martyr. But now, as the steel skeleton loomed beside her mural like a countdown to destruction, she understood that silence wasn't safety. It was a vacuum that Karen had been more than happy to fill. So Maria gave Ellis permission. Ellis contacted a journalist she knew, someone serious, local, not the kind that churned out clickbait. Within 24 hours, a piece went live on a regional news outlet. When a mural becomes a battleground, how one neighborhood is using policy to erase art. The article didn't use inflammatory language. It didn't accuse. It documented, with timestamps, with city responses, with quiet, devastating precision. The reaction was swift, but not entirely expected. Some readers responded with outrage, others with predictable skepticism. But what Maria hadn't counted on was that someone on the city's Cultural Preservation Board would read the article and recognize her mural from their internal review files. 3 days after the article published, Maria received a certified letter from the board. Her mural had been unanimously approved for formal designation as a protected cultural asset under the Public Visual Heritage Code. Effective immediately, it was included in the city's official public arts register. Tampering with it was now a misdemeanor. Unauthorized construction within 5 feet of it was now subject to legal review. Maria read the letter twice before allowing herself to breathe. She forwarded it to Ellis, then printed it and pinned a copy beside her front door. The same evening, 2 plainclothes officers arrived at her home. They said they were responding to a call Maria hadn't made. A neighbor had reported unauthorized scaffolding with potential safety hazards. The officers walked the alley, took photos, and filed a report. Within the hour, a municipal vehicle arrived and began dismantling the structure. The workers said nothing. They did their job and left. When the last bolt was pulled from the concrete, Maria stood in the empty alley watching the wall return to its exposed, vulnerable, beautiful self. But then came the email. It was from Karen. Not signed, but it had her tone, her punctuation, her sterile grammar. The sender's address was generic, an anonymous neighborhood account. The message was only 2 sentences long. "Congratulations. You've won the battle, but walls can be repainted, and memories can be rewritten." Maria didn't reply. She forwarded the email to Ellis, then opened her back gate and walked the full length of the alley again, scanning for anything new. There were no signs of tampering, no shadows in corners, but she knew better than to feel safe. 2 days later, at 2:11 a.m., the motion sensor floodlight triggered. Maria, already sleeping on the couch by habit, sprang awake and checked the monitor. A figure in a gray hoodie stood directly in front of the mural. No spray can, no tools, just standing, staring. They didn't move. For over a minute, they remained motionless. Then they stepped back, looked directly at the camera, and raised a hand, palm out like a stop signal. Then they turned and walked into the darkness. Maria sent the footage to the city and to Ellis. No one could identify the person. The police filed it as non-threatening loitering. The mural remained untouched. But the message was clear. Someone wanted her to know they could come close, closer than comfort allowed. But the story was no longer just Maria's. 2 weeks after the article went live, the mural was added to a growing digital map of the city's protected community art. The tour route was updated. Visitors began arriving, slowly at first. A man with a notepad and camera. A pair of students sketching on a bench. A woman who stood for 10 minutes in silence, then whispered, "Thank you," and left. Maria never approached them. She didn't ask questions. She let them come and go like tides. Some days she brought out water bottles. Once she left fresh rosemary tied with string on the fence. The presence of visitors changed the energy of the space. It became less isolated, less vulnerable. Even Karen noticed. She stopped passing by the alley. Her car took longer routes. Her name vanished from flyers. For the first time since the battle had begun, Maria felt the ground shift. Then, in early spring, the city called again. A new initiative, an oral history project documenting the stories behind public murals, wanted to include her. They asked for an interview, photos, possibly a short audio recording. Maria agreed with one condition. She would speak only from her kitchen, the place where the mural had been born in silence. The interview was simple. She spoke of her mother, of legacy, of losing someone who had given her everything and leaving behind something that couldn't be erased. She didn't mention Karen. She didn't mention scaffolding, sabotage, or anonymous threats. She spoke of paint, of grief, of choosing to create instead of collapse. The recording went live on the city's arts archive a month later. It was raw, quiet, powerful. Maria didn't tell anyone, but one afternoon she found a folded note in her mailbox. Handwritten, unfamiliar. It read, "I used to agree with her. I thought you were bringing trouble, but your voice reminded me of someone I loved. I was wrong." No signature, no return address. Maria kept it in the same folder as the threat letter, the fake citation, the QR code, not to erase the bad, but to remember the balance. The mural remained the same, but the space around it had changed. So had Maria. And this time the change had come not from destruction, but from persistence and presence. The heat that summer was relentless, the kind that turned metal fences too hot to touch and slowed time to a syrupy crawl. Maria spent most days indoors now, not out of fear anymore, but out of habit. Her routines had evolved, not constricted, but sharpened. She still cooked, still painted in private when the light was right, but she no longer waited for something to go wrong. The silence had taken on a different tone, less foreboding, more settled. The mural, after everything, still stood untouched. Not a new scratch, not another drop of gray paint, no more flyers or fake signs. Its surface bore the marks of time and weather, but none of malice. Maria had considered restoring the faded section near the base where the first attack had landed, but in the end she decided against it. The imperfection was part of it now. A scar, not a flaw. A reminder of what had been endured. Karen had disappeared from public life. Not dramatically. There was no resignation, no scene. She simply stopped. No more block emails, no more meeting notices, no more laminated posters on community bulletin boards. Her house still stood neat and square behind its trimmed hedges, but her name no longer echoed in conversations. At the last community meeting, which Maria attended quietly from the back of the room, someone else moderated. When Karen's name came up in passing, once in reference to a procedural vote, it was met with an awkward pause and a quick pivot to other matters. The power she had once wielded so casually had evaporated. not in a flash but in erosion, ground away by exposure and pushback, by consequences she had not predicted and a resolve she had underestimated. Maria never confronted her. She didn't need to. The fight had ended not with a single victory, but with Karen's quiet retreat and the city's validation. And more than that, with something far less tangible but just as real. The neighborhood's changed tone. People had begun to wave again, briefly at first, cautiously, then more. A man who walked his dog past her house every morning nodded and smiled. A woman who had once signed the petition against the mural crossed the street one afternoon and asked Maria what kind of paint she'd used to make the colors last. A small boy left a drawing in her mailbox, crayon lines depicting what was clearly her mural, stick figures smiling beneath it. Maria didn't romanticize the change. She knew how shallow performative friendliness could be, but she also knew that silence meant something different now. It was no longer weaponized. It was recovery. And that, for her, was enough. She never did find out who had nominated her mural for the city tour. Alan said the recommendation had come through an internal submission form, unsigned. Maria suspected it might have been one of the cultural officers who had visited early on, maybe Colin or Janine. But she didn't ask. She preferred not knowing. Not everything needed a name. Some support was meant to be invisible. Some resistance, too. By midsummer, the city installed a small bronze plaque beside the alley wall. Registered Cultural Landmark, City of Austin Public Art Archive. It was small, elegant, and understated. Beneath it was a QR code that led to her oral history, now archived permanently. When she first saw the plaque, Maria reached out and touched it with 2 fingers, gently. Then she went back inside and made mole from scratch, just like her mother used to. That night she ate alone on her porch as the mural glowed faintly under the amber light. The heat was still thick, but the air felt different. It was no longer war. It was home.